The moment Charles collapsed at his grandfather's gravestone, the supernatural tension snapped like a breaking wire. Jason and Mike didn't hesitate. They grabbed Charles under his arms as his body went limp, his eyes rolling back. Lisa and Chris, their faces pale with terror, lifted Sarah's unconscious form. The bitter December wind whipped around them as they stumbled through the snow-dusted cemetery paths, their breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. "Is he breathing?" Mike gasped, struggling with Charles's dead weight. The 14-year-old's red hoodie was damp with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Jason, his usual confidence shattered, could only focus on getting them out, away from that cursed gravestone, away from the name that had changed everything. Behind them, the cemetery seemed to exhale with malevolent satisfaction. The whispers that had plagued Charles and Sarah fell silent, but the silence felt more ominous than the supernatural chorus they'd grown to fear. They didn't stop running until they reached Jason's house, bursting through the front door with their unconscious friends, the warm glow of suburban normalcy feeling like a lie after what they'd witnessed. Charles stirred as they laid him on the couch, his blue eyes fluttering open with a distant, unfocused expression. But Sarah remained motionless, her sandy blonde curls matted against her pale forehead, her breathing shallow and irregular. Something was deeply wrong. Friday, January 1st, 1993. The digital clock in Sarah's hospital room glowed a steady 3:47 p.m. as winter light filtered through sterile windows. For 6 days she had remained in this state, not quite comatose, the doctors said, but unresponsive to all external stimuli. Her brain activity showed strange, intense patterns during what should have been sleep cycles, as if she were experiencing vivid, exhausting dreams. "She's been having the most intense dreams," a nurse mentioned quietly to Jason as she checked Sarah's monitors. "Your friend's vitals spike like she's running a marathon, but she won't wake up. We've never seen anything quite like it." Jason sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his leather jacket draped over the back, watching Sarah's still form. School was still out for winter break, which meant 6 students could spend their days visiting the hospital without anyone asking questions. The others had been taking shifts. Mike with his awkward attempts at conversation with the unconscious girl, Lisa and Chris bringing flowers and nervous chatter. Jason's Christmas gift, a beige 4-door Ford Escort with a stick shift, made it easier to get around town during these difficult days, though he'd rather have been anywhere else. But Jason felt responsible. He was the one who had led them to Zares, to Wellington Hills, to that cursed cemetery. Charles had been different since that night. Functional, spending the remaining days of winter break helping pack their mother's belongings for the hospital transfer. But there was something in his eyes now, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if he were looking through windows that opened onto very dark rooms. Their mother, Eleanor, had been admitted to Maplewood Hospice the day before, on New Year's Eve. The cancer, which he'd been fighting quietly for months, had suddenly accelerated with vicious efficiency, perhaps triggered by the unbearable stress of watching Sarah slip into that mysterious coma. She'd already lost her husband, a firefighter, 3 years earlier, whose death remained unexplained despite the investigation. Now, facing the possibility of losing her daughter, too, Eleanor's body seemed to simply surrender to the disease. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about rapid progression and making her comfortable. Charles had taken the news with an eerie calm that worried everyone who knew the emotional, anxious boy he'd been just weeks before. January 7th, 1993, the Maplewood Hospice sat on the quiet side of town, a converted Victorian mansion that managed to feel both comforting and somber. Eleanor's room overlooked a small garden where winter bare trees cast long shadows across patches of stubborn snow. She looked fragile against the crisp white sheets, her illness having stolen the vibrant energy that had always defined her. Jason had been staying with Charles since Eleanor's admission on New Year's Eve, partly to keep his friend company, partly because he was worried about the changes he had been witnessing over the past week. Today, he'd driven to the hospice with Mike, Lisa, and Chris to check on Eleanor's condition, give her an update on Sarah's unchanged state, and perhaps more importantly, to report on Charles's increasingly troubling behavior. Mike shifted uncomfortably in the bedside chair, his usual easy confidence diminished by the weight of impending loss. Lisa and Chris sat close together on a small couch, their perpetual giggles replaced by respectful whispers. Jason stood by the window, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, gathering the courage to voice his concerns. "How is he really?" Eleanor asked, her voice still carrying traces of its former strength, despite her weakened state. Her green eyes, so like Sarah's, held a weight of decades-old secrets, and Jason could tell she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Different," Jason said finally. "He's too calm for someone whose mother is dying and sister's in a coma, and he talks to himself constantly now. But the weird thing is, sometimes it sounds like someone's talking back to him. Like someone much older," Eleanor finished quietly. Jason nodded, relieved that she understood. "Mrs. Patterson, I think something's really wrong. Not just grief or stress, something else." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that had been building for decades. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about my family, about why this is happening to my children. I lied to Sarah and Charles about my father. I told them I never knew him, that he abandoned us. But that wasn't true." Her fingers worked nervously at the hospital blanket. "My father was Dr. Benedict Cowley, and he didn't abandon us. He killed my mother." The room fell silent except for the steady hum of medical equipment. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. Mike's face went ashen. "She was one of his subjects. He had a laboratory in the basement of my childhood home, said it was for private research. He told everyone, the family, the neighbors, anyone who asked, that she'd been having breakdowns, that she'd hurt herself during an episode. But I was 7 years old, and I saw what really happened. I saw him drag her down to that basement. I heard her screaming." Eleanor's voice cracked, decades of suppressed trauma bleeding through. "My aunt, my mother's sister, she got me out of there, legally adopted me, got me away from that house. But she kept the family secret until her deathbed. I was already married. Sarah was just an infant when she finally told me the truth about what he was doing in those experiments, about the thing he was trying to create." Jason found his voice first. "The entity. The fear thing. He made it? Eleanor nodded slowly. He believed that fear was a form of energy that could be harvested, concentrated, controlled. He used the patient's terror to feed something ancient, something that had been sleeping in the foundations of that place since it was built. And when the community finally shut down his operations, when they forced the asylum to close, he was so close to succeeding. "He died. We saw his grave," Mike said, confusion evident in his voice. "His body died," Eleanor corrected, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But he found a way to tie his consciousness to the entity he'd created. He's been waiting, dormant, looking for the right vessel, someone with the bloodline, someone young enough to reshape." The terrible implication hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles wasn't just being haunted or influenced, he was being prepared for something far worse. The days that followed Eleanor's revelation blurred together in a cycle of hospital visits and growing dread. Jason found himself spending more time at Sarah's bedside, partly to escape the increasingly unsettling presence of Charles at the hospice, partly because he felt Sarah might somehow sense his presence, even in her unconscious state. Today marked 3 days since learning the horrific truth about their family curse, and Charles's transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. Now, sitting in the familiar uncomfortable chair beside Sarah's hospital bed, Jason found himself hoping desperately that she would wake up soon. They needed her insight, her strength, and perhaps most importantly, they needed to know if any part of Charles could still be saved.